guards refused to let the old veteran near the casket until a general stopped the entire funeral. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. The funeral was supposed to be a dignified occasion, a time for family, friends, and military officials to say goodbye to General Wallace, a man who had served his country for decades. The sun hung low over Arlington National Cemetery, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns. The air was thick with the solemnity of the moment, yet something was off. At the entrance to the memorial service, two guards stood, their eyes scanning the crowd with a practiced coldness. They had seen it all before: dignitaries, family members, soldiers, and veterans. But today, they faced an old man, bent with age and weathered by time, wearing nothing more than a simple black suit that had seen better days. He stood quietly at the gate, his hands resting gently on the wooden cane that seemed to be his only support. The guards didn't see a respected veteran. They saw an elderly man in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this is a private service. You'll have to leave," one of the guards said, his voice flat and dismissive. The old man didn't flinch, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. "I'm here to pay my respects to General Wallace," he said, his voice low but firm. "He would have wanted me here." The younger guard scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Look, Grandpa, I don't have time for this. This is an invitation-only event. If you don't have credentials, you'll have to leave now." The tension in the air thickened. The crowd behind them started to take notice, whispering to one another, their curiosity piqued by the standoff. The old man remained silent, his posture unchanged. He wasn't there to argue. He wasn't there to make a scene. He simply wanted to say goodbye to his friend, a man who had fought beside him in battles that most people would never understand. The guards continued to stand their ground, their eyes narrowing as they saw no sign of backing down from the elderly man. "You can't just walk in here, old man," the second guard sneered. "This is a restricted event. If you don't leave, we'll have to escort you out." But as the words left his mouth, something shifted in the air. The faintest whisper of something, or someone approached. The sound of footsteps on gravel, steady and purposeful. The guard's voice faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Are you going to move along, or do we need to make you?" he asked again, this time more forcefully. The old man's eyes flickered to the horizon, as though he were staring into a memory long buried beneath years of silence. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made even the guards pause. "I'm here to honor the general." That's when it happened. A voice, loud and commanding, cut through the tension like a knife. "What's going on here?" The guards turned, startled, as a figure emerged from the shadows. A man in uniform, tall and imposing, his chest adorned with the gleaming ribbons and medals of a four-star general. The old man's eyes softened, his posture straightening, as if he had just seen a ghost from his past. The general approached, his face hard but his eyes filled with respect. Without a word, he turned to the guards, his presence alone enough to freeze them in their tracks. "Let him through," the general ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a lifetime of service. The guards hesitated, looking between the old man and the general, unsure of what to do. The general's gaze softened as he turned back to the elderly veteran. "You've earned the right to be here," he said, his voice steady. "Go ahead." And with that, the entire funeral procession came to a halt. The guards stood at attention, their rigid forms a stark contrast to the quiet reverence that now filled the air. The old man, with his worn suit and quiet dignity, was allowed to pass. And as he walked toward the casket of General Wallace, the sounds of the ceremony seemed to fade away, replaced by the weight of the moment. A moment of recognition, a moment of honor. It was then that the crowd realized who the old man was. Not just any veteran, but a living legend, a man who had fought beside General Wallace in countless battles, a man whose name had been whispered in hushed tones by those who had known him. The general's gesture had been one of profound respect, but it also served as a reminder that some heroes are never forgotten, no matter how quietly they lived their lives. The general's command had turned the entire atmosphere at the funeral from one of tense silence to a profound moment of respect. The old veteran, whose presence had been dismissed as nothing more than a nuisance, now stood front and center, facing the casket of his longtime comrade, General Wallace. The grief-stricken family, still in shock from the unexpected interruption, looked on, as if unable to comprehend the weight of what had just happened. The guards, once so firm in their stance, now stood at attention, their hands behind their backs, eyes focused on the ground in front of them. The quiet reverence that had descended upon the gathering was palpable. The old man, his cane still in his hand, moved slowly, each step deliberate, as though the weight of his years and his memories guided him toward the fallen general. His back was straight, and despite the frailty of his body, there was an undeniable air of dignity about him. He had waited a long time for this moment, a moment he had never expected would come. As he reached the casket, his gaze softened, his face a mask of both sorrow and resolve. He paused for a long moment, standing silently before his friend, as the distant sound of helicopters and the hum of distant voices seemed to fade away. The world had narrowed down to this one moment. As the old man stood in front of the casket, a familiar voice, one he had not heard in decades, echoed in his mind. "You saved my life, John. One day, I'll find you and repay you." The voice of General Wallace came to him, soft yet powerful, as clear as it had been all those years ago. The memory of that fateful day in Vietnam, when General Wallace had been gravely wounded, came rushing back. The old man had carried him through the jungle, under enemy fire, through rain and mud, just to get him to safety. He had kept his promise then, saving Wallace's life when no one else could, and now, all these years later, Wallace had kept his word. The old man reached out, his hand trembling as he placed it on the edge of the casket. He didn't speak. Words didn't seem necessary. His silent gesture was more than enough. The general, who had already earned the respect of everyone in attendance, stood quietly beside him, his hands clasped in front of him, as if in acknowledgement of the unspoken bond between the two men. The ceremony had taken a turn that no one had anticipated. The crowd, once murmuring and uncertain, had gone completely silent. The presence of the general had done more than just demand respect for the old man. It had also conveyed a message to everyone present about the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and loyalty. The old man, whose name was John Miller, had never sought recognition. He had never wanted the accolades or the medals. What mattered most to him was that he had done what needed to be done for his comrades, without hesitation, without question. And now, after all these years, after living in the shadows of his own memories, he had been brought to this moment of recognition. The general, a four-star officer who had commanded countless men and led them to victory, had paused everything for John Miller. It was a rare and powerful gesture, one that few in the room could have expected. As the ceremony continued, the family members and friends of General Wallace began to gather closer, their faces a mixture of awe and respect. They had heard the whispers about the man who had been invited to the funeral, the man who had walked in uninvited, but now they saw the truth for themselves. The old man wasn't just any veteran. He was a living legend, a man whose quiet dignity had been recognized by the highest authority in the military. It was a fitting tribute, one that would forever remain in the memories of those who had witnessed it. For John Miller, however, it wasn't about the recognition. It wasn't about the salute or the applause. It was about the bond he had shared with Wallace, a bond forged in the heat of battle, a bond that had lasted long after the war had ended. As the ceremony concluded, and the last of the mourners began to leave, John Miller remained standing at the casket. The general had already made his departure, but the veteran stayed behind, taking a final moment to say goodbye to his friend, to the man who had once been by his side in the darkest hours. The sun had now set, and the cemetery was quiet, save for the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. It was a moment of peace, a moment that John Miller had earned, a moment that was long overdue. As the crowd dispersed and the funeral ceremony came to a quiet end, John Miller remained standing by the casket, his back straight, his mind adrift in a sea of memories. The general, having given the final salute and ensured that everything was in order, had already left the grounds. The sounds of the ceremony faded into the distance, leaving only the soft rustle of the trees and the distant hum of city life that seemed so far removed from the sacred ground of Arlington. John's thoughts were with Wallace, the man who had been more than just a comrade in arms. They had fought side by side in the jungles of Vietnam, enduring the harshest of conditions, the deafening sounds of battle, and the unspeakable horrors of war. Wallace had always been there, a steady presence in the chaos, a leader who never wavered, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. John had never sought the accolades or recognition that came with the territory of being a hero. For him, it had always been about the work, the mission, and the bond with his brothers in arms. But now, after all these years, he found himself standing alone, a forgotten man in a forgotten war, thrust into the spotlight of a nation that had long since moved on. As the wind whispered through the trees, John reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was a picture of him and Wallace, taken all those years ago in the heat of battle. They were young men then, full of fire and determination, standing shoulder to shoulder in the face of death. The photograph had faded with time, the edges curling, the ink smudged from decades of being carried around, but the faces were still clear in his mind. Wallace had always been the one to keep the men together, to inspire them with his calm demeanor and his unwavering belief that they would make it out alive. John had been his right hand, the quiet one, the medic who patched up the wounded and kept the group moving forward, no matter the cost. As he stood there, staring at the photograph, John felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned slowly, his old body creaking with the effort. The general had returned, his face serious but his eyes warm with understanding. "You okay, Miller?" the general asked, his voice soft but commanding. John nodded slowly, tucking the photograph back into his pocket. "I'm fine, sir," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The general studied him for a moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. "I knew you two were close," he said, his voice quieter now. "Wallace spoke of you often. Said you were the reason he made it out of that hellhole." John didn't respond. There was no need to. The general had heard the stories, the ones that only the men who had been there could understand. The ones that didn't need words to convey the depth of the bond that had been forged in the fires of war. The general's eyes softened. "He was proud of you, you know," he said quietly. John didn't answer. He didn't need to. The words were enough. The general's presence had been a form of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had once existed between them, a bond that had never truly faded, even as the years passed and the world moved on. As the general turned to leave, John watched him go, his heart heavy with the weight of a lifetime of memories. He wasn't sure what the future held for him, but for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt seen. The general's respect, the recognition of his service, had given him something he hadn't expected to find in his twilight years. For so long, he had lived in the shadows of his past, content to remain in the background, never seeking the limelight. But today, in this quiet corner of Arlington, he had been seen. And in that moment, it was enough. As the ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery concluded, John Miller stood silently by the gravesite, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. The crowd had already begun to disperse, but he remained rooted to the spot, his mind replaying the past like an old film reel. He had been through so much in his life, and yet, it felt as though today was the first time in years that he had truly been seen. The presence of the general, the respect shown to him, was something he never expected. It had been so long since anyone had recognized the sacrifices he made, the battles he fought, not for the medals, not for the glory, but for his comrades. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows over the cemetery. The air was cool, and the sky above was streaked with the soft hues of twilight. John stood there for a moment longer, feeling as though the world had slowed, the bustling pace of life outside the cemetery fading into a distant hum. As he stood at the edge of the grave, the breeze whispered through the trees, and the leaves rustled softly. He thought about Wallace, the man who had saved his life, and whom he had returned the favor to countless times. Wallace was the one who had always been there, the one who had led them through some of the toughest battles. He had been the rock, the one who kept them all together when everything seemed to be falling apart. John had carried him through jungles, over enemy lines, through moments of terror and exhaustion. And now, Wallace was gone, But John had kept his promise, just as he always had. His thoughts were interrupted as a car drove slowly toward the cemetery gates. He turned, his eyes narrowing slightly as the vehicle came into view. It wasn't just any car, it was a military convoy, marked with the insignia of high command. The familiar, imposing presence of the convoy caused a stir among the remaining mourners. As the car stopped, a group of officers disembarked, their crisp uniforms and polished boots shining in the dimming light. At the forefront of the group was a figure John knew all too well. The general. The man who had stopped the funeral, who had shown John the respect that had been denied to him for so long. The general approached. John, his pace slow but deliberate. He stopped just a few feet away, his gaze fixed on John with an intensity that spoke volumes. There was a moment of silence between them, an unspoken understanding passing between the two men. Then, with a quiet but commanding voice, the general spoke. John, he said, his words carrying the weight of years of shared experience. It's time we talked. John didn't reply immediately. He simply nodded, his eyes locked onto the general's. It was as if the two of them had stepped back into a different time, one where words weren't needed to convey the depth of their connection. The general's voice softened. I never got the chance to say this, but I owe you more than I can ever repay. You saved my life, and you've carried that burden alone for far too long. I owe you my life, John. John swallowed hard, the lump in his throat rising. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them hit him with the force of a freight train. It wasn't about the medals, the honors, or the recognition. It was about the bond they shared, the bond that had been forged in the heat of battle and had survived the years, untouched by time. You don't owe me anything, sir, John finally said, his voice rough but steady. I did what anyone would have done. We all did what we had to do. The general shook his head, a rare sadness flickering in his eyes. No, John, not everyone would have done what you did. You were there when no one else could be. You kept us alive when we had nothing left to give. That's something no one else can say. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The general looked at the gravestone of his fallen comrade, then back at John. Wallace spoke of you often. He said you were the reason he made it out of that hellhole. And I believe him. You're not just a hero, John. You're a living legend. I just wish more people knew that. John felt a rush of emotion welling up inside him, but he fought it back, the same way he had always done. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, this kind of recognition. For so many years, he had been content to stay in the shadows, to let the world move on without him. But here, in this moment, surrounded by the memories of war and the quiet reverence of those who had witnessed his service, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt valued. Thank you, sir, John said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. But I didn't do it for the recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do. The general nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I know that, John. And that's what makes you different. That's what makes you a true hero. The silence between them deepened, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence of understanding, of mutual respect, of two men who had seen and endured more than most could ever imagine. And as the sun finally set behind the cemetery, casting its golden glow over the gravestones, John Miller felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just a forgotten veteran anymore. He was someone who had been seen, recognized, and most importantly, respected. And that, in the end, was all he had ever really wanted. As the days passed after the funeral, John Miller found himself at peace, in a way that he had not felt in years. The recognition he had received from the general was enough to soothe the quiet ache in his heart, but it was more than just the acknowledgement. It was the understanding that what he had done, what he had sacrificed, had not been forgotten. The world had moved on from the days of war, from the time when men like him had walked the earth with the weight of their memories heavy on their shoulders. But for a brief moment, he had been seen for what he truly was, a man who had given everything for the greater good, for his comrades, and for his country. He had been seen as a hero, not because of the medals or the stories that had been told about him, but because he had simply done what needed to be done. As he sat on the porch of his small house, the light of the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard, John thought about the long years of silence that had stretched between the war and now. So much had changed in the world, so much had moved forward, but the memories remained, locked in his mind like the pages of a forgotten book. His life had been lived in the background, always just out of the spotlight, always a soldier in the shadows. But now, it seemed that the world had caught up to him. He wasn't just a forgotten man anymore. He was someone who had been remembered. The door to his house opened, and the familiar figure of his daughter stepped out onto the porch. She was older now, with children of her own, but there was still something about the way she walked, the way she smiled, that reminded him of the little girl he had left behind all those years ago. She sat beside him, and for a moment, they said nothing. It was one of those rare, comfortable silences that only family could share. Finally, she spoke. "Dad, I've been thinking," she said, her voice gentle but full of curiosity, "about what the general said at the funeral." John turned to her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "What about it?" he asked. I think it's time you told me the whole story," she said, her eyes soft with understanding. "I know bits and pieces, but I've never heard it all from you. What happened back then, when you and General Wallace were in Vietnam?" John's heart tightened at the question. He had never told her the full story, never shared the details of the horrors they had faced, the things they had done to survive. But now, sitting there in the quiet comfort of his home, with the weight of a lifetime of memories behind him, he realized that it was time. It was time to let her in. "I've never wanted to talk about it," he began slowly, his voice rough. Some things are better left unsaid. But you deserve to know the truth." He paused, collecting his thoughts, as his daughter waited patiently. The words came slowly, but once they began, they flowed like a river that had been dammed for too long. "General Wallace and I, we were in the thick of it. We weren't just soldiers. We were the ones who kept the unit together when everything else was falling apart. We saw things, terrible things that change you, things that you can never forget. And we did whatever we had to do to survive. Whatever it took." He stopped, his mind drifting back to those long nights in the jungle, when every step could have been your last. Wallace, he was always the one who kept us going. He never showed fear, never showed weakness. He was a leader in every sense of the word. And I was right there with him, doing what I had to do to keep him and the others alive. We both made it out of that hell, but we left pieces of ourselves behind. I left parts of me that I'll never get back. His daughter nodded, understanding in her eyes. She had always known that there was more to his past than the quiet man who sat in his chair reading the paper. But now, hearing the weight of his words, she understood just how much he had carried with him all these years. "And Wallace," she asked softly, "what about him? What happened to him after?" John looked down at his hands, the memories of his friend's final days flooding back. He never really left the war behind. None of us did. But Wallace, he tried. He tried to live a normal life after. He even became a mentor to younger soldiers, trying to make sure they didn't have to carry the same burdens we did. But in the end, the war caught up with him. It always does. His voice trailed off, the pain of that final loss still fresh, even after all these years. "He didn't make it out like I did, but I made a promise to him. And today, that promise was finally honored." His daughter reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You've carried that weight for so long, Dad," she said quietly. "But you're not alone anymore. You have us. And you're finally being recognized for what you truly are, a hero." The words felt strange to him, but they were also true. For so long, he had been content to live in the shadows, never seeking the spotlight, never asking for recognition. But now, in this quiet moment with his daughter, he realized that maybe it was time to step into the light, to embrace the legacy he had earned. It wasn't about the medals or the titles. It was about the people he had saved, the lives he had touched, and the sacrifices he had made. It was time to let the world see him for who he really was. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. Ready to let go of the past, ready to honor the man he had been, and ready to embrace the future that was still ahead of him. As the days passed, the world outside John Miller's small home seemed to move at a rapid pace, a pace that had never quite matched his own. The recognition he had received from the general, the ceremony, and the conversations with his daughter had left him with a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, relief, and an unfamiliar sense of peace. But that peace was not meant to last long. It was early in the morning when the knock at the door came. John, having just finished his coffee, rose slowly from his chair, his body creaking with the usual aches of age. He wasn't expecting anyone, so the sound of the knock, firm and deliberate, piqued his curiosity. As he opened the door, he was greeted by a familiar face. Colonel Hayes, the officer who had played a part in ensuring John was finally honored at the funeral. "Good morning, sir," the colonel said, his expression serious but respectful. "May I come in?" John nodded, stepping aside to allow him into the house. He motioned for the colonel to sit, but Hayes remained standing, his eyes scanning the room as if weighing something important. "What's on your mind, Colonel?" John asked, his voice steady but curious. The colonel took a breath, then looked John directly in the eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the funeral. You know, the general and we talked. And after the ceremony, I couldn't shake this feeling that something wasn't finished. There's more to your story, John. More that I think needs to be told." John raised an eyebrow, feeling a flicker of unease. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, his mind already racing. Hayes hesitated, as if considering the weight of his next words. "There are still people out there, John. People who don't know what you did. They don't know the full extent of your service, the sacrifices you made. I've been in touch with some of the higher-ups, and there's a possibility that this could be a bigger story than we thought. You could be recognized in ways that go beyond what happened at the funeral." John sat up straighter, his mind swirling with the implications of the colonel's words. He had never sought fame or attention, had always avoided the spotlight. But the idea that others might finally understand what he had done, what he and his brothers had gone through, was a difficult one to ignore. "I'm not looking for a medal, Colonel," John said, his voice firm but calm. "I don't need any more recognition. What I did, what Wallace and I did, we did because it was the right thing to do. Not for a plaque or a ceremony. Not for any kind of reward." Hayes nodded, clearly understanding the depth of John's words. "I get it, John. But this isn't about a medal. It's about giving people the truth. Giving them a chance to understand what veterans like you have been through, and why we owe you more than we could ever repay." The colonel paused, as if gathering his thoughts before continuing. "You're not the only one who's been living in the shadows, John. There are a lot of men like you. Men who went unnoticed, who never asked for anything but were willing to give everything for their country. I think it's time people knew what true heroism looks like." John's mind raced, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. He had always kept his experiences to himself, not wanting to burden others with the heavy truths of war. But hearing the colonel's words stirred something inside him, a desire for closure, for the recognition of not just his actions, but the actions of all the men who had fought alongside him. "What do you want from me, Colonel?" John asked, his voice quieter now, the gravity of the conversation sinking in. Hayes met his gaze steadily, his expression unwavering. "I want you to tell your story, not for the glory, but for the men you served with. The ones who never made it home. The ones who are still out there, struggling in silence." John sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. He thought of the countless nights spent in the jungle, of the faces of those he had lost, of the promises made and kept. He thought of Wallace, of their shared experiences, of the life they had once lived. "I don't know if I can," John said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been so long. I've buried it all deep inside." Hayes nodded, understanding. "You don't have to do it all at once. But when you're ready, we'll be here to help you share it. There are people out there who need to hear what you have to say, John. You've been silent for too long." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. John sat in silence for a long moment, his thoughts spiraling. Finally, he looked up at the colonel, his expression resolute. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "For the men who never came home. For the ones still fighting their battles." Hayes's face softened, a look of respect and gratitude crossing his features. "Thank you, John. You're doing the right thing." As the colonel stood to leave, John watched him walk toward the door. He felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, but also a sense of responsibility. The stories he had kept buried for so long, the pain he had hidden deep inside, were now going to be shared with the world. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to step into the light, to honor the past, and give the world the truth it had long since forgotten. John Miller sat quietly in his small living room, the soft hum of the fan the only sound in the house. He had agreed to share his story, to finally let the world know the truth about what had happened all those years ago, about the bond he had shared with Wallace and the men who had fought beside him. It had taken time for him to come to this decision, to understand that sharing his story wasn't about seeking recognition. It was about honoring those who had been left behind, the ones who had given everything and never had the chance to be remembered. It was about giving a voice to the countless veterans who had silently carried their burdens for years. The colonel had been right. It wasn't just about him. It was about all the men who had fought and the ones who were still out there, struggling with their own battles in silence. The truth had been buried for so long, but now, it was time to bring it to light. The phone rang, breaking the silence, and John's heart skipped a beat. It was the colonel. "John?" The colonel's voice was steady but filled with urgency. "We've got a situation. We're ready to begin the interview. The media is interested, and we've got the support we need to get your story out there. Are you ready?" John hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision settle in his chest. This wasn't going to be easy. It never was. But he had made a promise to himself and to the men who had fought beside him, to tell the truth, no matter how hard it was. "I'm ready," he said finally, his voice calm but resolute. "Let's do it." The colonel's voice softened, a touch of respect in his tone. "Good. We'll be there soon. Just remember, John, this is for them. The ones who never came home." The line went dead, and John sat back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. The memories came rushing back, the faces of the men who had shared the same hell he had. He could still see them, hear their voices, smell the smoke and the blood in the air. It felt like it had happened only yesterday, but so much time had passed. He had buried it all deep inside, trying to live a normal life, trying to forget. But now, the time had come to face it all, to speak the truth, no matter the cost. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts, and he stood up slowly, his knees aching as he walked to the door. When he opened it, the colonel was standing there, flanked by a few others, journalists, camera operators, and a small team of officials. They were ready. John could feel the weight of their gazes, the expectation in the air. "We're all set, John," the colonel said, his tone reassuring. "You don't have to do this alone. We've got your back." John nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wasn't sure what to expect from this interview, but he knew one thing. He couldn't back down now. As they made their way to the small studio set up in his living room, John could feel the nerves rising inside him. He wasn't used to this, wasn't used to being the center of attention. But this wasn't about him. It was about the men he had served with, the ones who had made the ultimate sacrifice. He took his seat in front of the camera, the lights shining brightly in his face. The interviewer, a woman in her 30s with a calm, professional demeanor, smiled at him. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us today, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice warm but formal. "We know this isn't easy, but your story is one that needs to be heard." John nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm not here for glory or recognition," he said, his voice steady but low. "I'm here for the men who didn't make it, the ones who gave everything and never got the chance to be remembered. They're the ones who deserve the attention, not me." The interviewer's eyes softened, but she nodded in understanding. "We understand, Mr. Miller. But your story is important. It's a story that speaks to the strength, courage, and sacrifice of every soldier who served and continues to serve this country. We're ready when you are." John took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment as the memories flooded back. The faces of his comrades, their laughter, their struggles, the moments of terror and the moments of triumph. He thought of Wallace, of the promises they had made to each other, of the things they had seen that no one should ever have to witness. He opened his eyes and looked into the camera, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "It was 1968, he began, his voice strong, though it trembled with emotion. "We were in the Asha Valley, fighting for our lives, fighting for each other. We weren't just soldiers. We were brothers. We had each other's backs, no matter what. And we made it through hell together." He paused, swallowing hard as the memory of that day washed over him. Wallace, he was the one who kept us going. Even when everything around us was falling apart, he was the one who kept us alive. He was a leader, a friend, and a hero. And I just did what I had to do to keep him alive, to keep us all alive. That's all I did. I didn't want any recognition. I didn't want anyone to know what I did. I just wanted to survive. And I did. He fell silent, the weight of the words sinking in. He wasn't sure what else to say, but the interviewer sat in silence, letting the moment hang in the air. The camera continued to roll, capturing every word, every emotion, every truth. It wasn't about the medals, the honors, or the recognition. It was about the men who had been there, who had lived and died by each other's side. It was about them. And John was finally ready to let their story be heard. As the interview continued, John Miller felt a strange sense of release. The words had been trapped inside him for so long, buried beneath layers of time and silence. But now they were finally being spoken aloud. The camera captured every moment, every word, and despite the nerves that still lingered, he felt an odd sense of catharsis. His story, the one he had kept to himself for decades, was being told to the world. And while part of him still wished to remain in the shadows, another part, the part that had been buried for so long, was finally standing in the light. The interviewer asked him about his experiences, about the moments that had defined his time in Vietnam. John spoke about the missions, the camaraderie, the fear, and the moments of triumph that had been overshadowed by the never-ending battles. But it was when they asked him about Wallace, about the man who had been his rock during those dark times, that John's voice faltered for the first time. He paused, his throat tight as the memory of his friend flooded back. Wallace had been more than a leader. He had been a brother, someone John had trusted with his life. And the day Wallace had been lost, the day John had been forced to say goodbye to him, had been the hardest moment of his life. Wallace was different, John said, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't just a leader. He was the kind of man who made you want to be better, who made you believe that you could make it through the worst of it. We fought together, side by side. And when things got tough, when the world around us was falling apart, it was Wallace who kept us together. He was the heart of our team. John's eyes dropped to the floor, his mind drifting back to that final moment, the one that had haunted him all these years. We were in the jungle, pinned down by enemy fire. Wallace had been hit, and we were trying to get him out. I carried him through the trees, through the mud, through the rain. I thought I could make it. I thought I could save him. But he didn't make it. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing. I promised him I'd get him out. I couldn't keep that promise. And that's something I've carried with me every day since. The interviewer gave him a moment, sensing the weight of the emotion in John's words. She didn't ask him to continue. Instead, she simply nodded, her expression filled with empathy. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, Mr. Miller, she said softly. We understand. John nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. The pain of that moment had never truly gone away, but talking about it, sharing it with someone else, made it feel a little less heavy. For the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone in that memory. As the interview continued, John spoke about the men he had served with, the ones who had made it through, and the ones who hadn't. He talked about the fear, the brotherhood, the unspoken understanding that existed between soldiers. We weren't just fighting for the country, he said, his voice steady now. We were fighting for each other. Every man out there was family. And when you're out there, facing what we faced, you know that if you go down, you're not just letting yourself down. You're letting down every man beside you. The interviewer nodded, clearly moved by his words. And yet, she asked, you never spoke about it. You never sought recognition. What? John paused for a long time, thinking about the question. He had never been one to seek attention, to step into the spotlight. He had always believed that what he and the others had done was simply their duty. It wasn't something that needed to be celebrated or recognized. It wasn't about me, he said quietly. It was about the men I fought with. It was about the ones who didn't make it home. The ones who are still out there, struggling. They're the ones who deserve recognition, not me. The interviewer sat back, clearly impressed by his humility. And yet, she said gently, you've finally agreed to tell your story, to let the world hear it. John looked at her, his expression resolute. I'm not doing this for me, he said firmly. I'm doing this for them. The ones who never made it back. The ones who have been forgotten. If my story helps even one person understand what we went through, what we lost, then it's worth it. The camera kept rolling, capturing every word, every emotion. John felt the weight of the moment settling around him. This was it. His story was being told. And though it was painful, though it brought up memories he had long buried, it felt right. It was time. As the interview wrapped up, John sat back in his chair, exhausted but relieved. The crew began to pack up, and the colonel gave him a nod of approval. You did good, John, he said quietly. You did more than good. You did something important. John gave a small smile, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally doing something that mattered. And that, in itself, was enough. The days following the interview felt surreal to John Miller. The weight of his words, the memories, and the emotions that he had kept buried for so long now seemed to hang in the air, like a thick fog that wouldn't lift. The media had run with the story, and it had spread quickly. John wasn't sure how he felt about that. He had never asked for this kind of attention, never wanted to be in the spotlight. But as the phone calls and messages poured in, he realized something. The recognition wasn't just about him. It was about the men he had fought beside, the ones who had sacrificed everything and never had a voice. It was their story too. As he sat in his living room, the phone rang again. This time, it was a familiar voice, Colonel Hayes. "John, I wanted to check in with you," Hayes said, his tone both professional and warm. "We've been getting a lot of feedback. The story's resonating with a lot of people, especially veterans. It's doing exactly what we hoped it would do, shining a light on those who've been forgotten." John nodded, even though he knew Hayes couldn't see him. He was sitting in his chair, the same chair he'd spent countless hours in, but now it felt different. It wasn't just his life he was reflecting on. It was the lives of so many others. "I didn't do it for the recognition," John said, his voice steady. "I did it for them. For the ones who never came home. For the ones who are still struggling, still carrying the weight." "I know, John. And that's why this matters," Hayes replied. "You're helping to give them a voice. Your story is making people see the truth of what veterans go through. And it's inspiring others to speak out too." John sat back, his mind racing. The truth was, he hadn't expected any of this. He hadn't expected the attention, the recognition. He had only wanted to honor those who had fought beside him, those who had paid the ultimate price. But now, it seemed as though the floodgates had opened. "I just hope people understand," John said quietly. "This isn't about glorifying war. It's not about celebrating the violence or the loss. It's about the bond we shared, the sacrifices we made for each other. That's what I want people to understand. That's what matters." "I think they do, John," Hayes said. "And your voice is helping others to understand too. You've given them a platform to share their stories, to finally be heard." The words lingered in the air between them, and for a moment, there was silence. John had always been the quiet one, the one who preferred to stay out of the limelight. But now, it seemed as though his quiet resolve was speaking louder than anything he could have imagined. He wasn't just a veteran with a past. He was a voice for all the veterans who had never been able to share their own stories. "I didn't want to be a hero," John said, almost to himself. "I just wanted to do what was right." Hayes' voice softened. "You did, John. You did exactly what was right." The conversation ended, but John didn't hang up the phone immediately. He sat there for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened, everything he had shared. The flood of emotions that had been building up inside him for years seemed to have found their release. He wasn't just a forgotten man anymore. His story, the story of all the men he had served with, was finally being heard. As the days went by, John found that people began to reach out to him, not just veterans, but civilians as well. People who had never served in the military, but who had been touched by his story. They would call, write, or send messages, thanking him for sharing the truth, for helping them understand the sacrifices of those who served. For the first time in a long time, John felt a sense of connection. He wasn't just the old man sitting alone in his living room. He was part of something larger, something that mattered. The impact of his words was becoming more apparent with each passing day. It wasn't just about the recognition. It was about the change that was happening, the understanding that was spreading. Veterans who had kept their stories hidden for years were starting to speak out, to share their own experiences. It was as though a weight had been lifted off their shoulders as well. And as John sat there, he realized something else. He wasn't just telling his own story. He was part of a larger movement, one that was finally bringing attention to the struggles of those who had fought for this country. It was a movement that was changing the way people thought about veterans, about sacrifice, and about the price of freedom. The phone rang again. This time, it was a reporter. "Mr. Miller," the reporter said, "we've been following the story closely. We'd love to do a follow-up interview with you. It seems like people are really connecting with your story. They want to hear more." John took a deep breath, then looked out the window, where the sun was beginning to set. He thought about the long journey that had brought him to this moment, the memories of those who had come before him, and those who were still fighting battles of their own. "I'll do it," John said, his voice steady. But this time, it's not just about me. It's about all of us. The ones who made it, and the ones who didn't. He hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, feeling a sense of purpose settle over him. This was just the beginning. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The follow-up interview went better than John had expected. The reporter was kind, patient, and truly interested in what he had to say. As the camera rolled, John found himself sharing more than he ever thought he would. He spoke of his time in Vietnam, the bonds he had formed with his comrades, and the brutal reality of war. He talked about the fear, the exhaustion, and the constant danger. But more than anything, he spoke about the men who had fought beside him, the ones who had not made it back. "We weren't just soldiers," John said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We were brothers. And when you're out there, it's not about orders or duty. It's about making sure the man next to you makes it home. We fought for each other, not for medals or recognition. That's what it was all about." The reporter listened intently, nodding along, her eyes never leaving him. "And what about now?" she asked, after a moment of silence. "What do you think has changed for veterans like you since the war? How do you feel about the recognition you're receiving now?" John paused for a moment, thinking. It had been a long time since he had been asked such a question. He had lived most of his life avoiding attention, staying out of the spotlight. But now, with the stories of his brothers coming to light, he felt a responsibility. "It's bittersweet," he said finally. "I never wanted recognition. I just did what had to be done. But now, I see that telling my story, telling our story, is important. It's about making sure the sacrifices of those who fought aren't forgotten. It's about showing people what veterans go through, the price we've paid, not just in combat, but in our everyday lives. The recognition is nice, but it's not the reason I'm doing this. It's for them. For the ones who never came home. For the ones who are still out there, fighting battles no one can see." The reporter looked down for a moment, clearly moved by his words. "Your story has inspired a lot of people, John," she said softly. "Veterans who've never spoken about their experiences are starting to share their own stories, too. You've given them a voice, one they didn't know they had." John felt a lump in his throat as he absorbed her words. It was true. He had never wanted to be the one to speak out. But now, hearing that his story had helped others, he understood that this was more than just a personal journey. This was about giving voice to an entire generation of men who had been silenced, forgotten, or misunderstood. As the interview ended and the cameras were packed away, John sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the day's events. He had shared more of himself than he ever thought possible, and yet, he felt lighter somehow. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond simply surviving. He wasn't just a man with a past anymore. He was part of a movement, a voice for those who had been forgotten. As he left the small studio set up in his home, John was approached by one of the crew members. "Mr. Miller, I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "Your story is going to make a difference. You've already started to change things." John smiled softly, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "I don't know if I've changed anything," he replied. "But if my story helps even one person understand what we went through, then it was worth it." The crew member nodded, and John stepped out of the room, his mind still racing. As he made his way back to his living room, he found himself thinking about his fellow veterans, the ones he had fought alongside, the ones who had been left behind in the memories of those who had survived. He thought of Wallace, of the promise he had made to his friend, and of the men he had saved, some of whom would never know the full extent of the sacrifice. And he realized that, in telling his story, he had done something more than just share his past. He had ensured that the legacy of those men would live on. For the first time in his life, John felt at peace with the past. He wasn't just a forgotten veteran anymore. He was a man who had given his all for his country, and now, the world knew it. He had shared his story, and, in doing so, he had honored the lives of his brothers in arms. He wasn't just telling his story, he was telling their story too. And that, he realized, was the greatest honor he could ever receive. Weeks passed, and John Miller found himself in a rhythm he hadn't expected. The interviews had become more frequent, the story spreading far beyond his small circle. His phone buzzed constantly, calls from reporters, veterans, and even strangers who simply wanted to thank him. John had never craved this kind of attention, but he had come to realize that what he had done, sharing his story, had begun to make a difference. It wasn't about him. It was about the men he had fought alongside, the ones who didn't make it home, the ones who never had a chance to speak. He was simply the vessel through which their voices could finally be heard. He had started to see the effects, too. Veterans who had remained silent for decades were coming forward, telling their stories, sharing their pain, their triumphs, their losses. And the public, the people who had never been in combat, were starting to understand the true cost of war. The emotional toll, the mental scars, the sacrifices that went beyond the battlefield. It was a quiet revolution, but it was happening. One afternoon, as John sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee and reflecting on all that had happened, there was a knock at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone, so the sudden sound startled him. He stood slowly, his old knees creaking as he made his way to the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see a young man standing there, dressed in civilian clothes, but with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. The man looked at him, hesitant but determined. "Mr. Miller?" he asked, his voice shaky. John nodded. "That's me. What can I do for you?" The man hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I just wanted to thank you for sharing your story. I'm a veteran too, and your words, the man's voice faltered, and John could see the emotion in his eyes. They've helped me. They've given me the courage to speak about my own experiences. I've been carrying them for so long, and after hearing your story, I realized I'm not alone. John's heart tightened. He had never expected to be the one to inspire someone, to give someone the strength to open up about their pain. But here it was, right in front of him. The man stepped forward, extending his hand. "My name's Jason. I was in Afghanistan. I've been home for 5 years, but it's been hard. Really hard." John reached out and shook Jason's hand, feeling the roughness of his grip, the calluses from years of service. "It's never easy," John said softly, his voice steady. "I've been back for longer than I care to admit, but there's still days when it feels like I'm back there, like I'm still carrying the weight." Jason nodded, his eyes downcast for a moment. "I've been keeping it all inside, pretending everything's fine. But after hearing you speak, after hearing your story, I finally reached out for help. I've started going to therapy, talking to others who get it." John smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's a big step, Jason," he said. "It's not easy to ask for help, especially for us. We're trained to be tough, to hold it all in. But you can't keep it in forever. It'll break you down if you do." Jason looked at him, gratitude in his eyes. "You gave me that realization. You gave me the strength to start dealing with it. And I'm not the only one. There are others out there, listening to your story, who feel the same way." John's mind flashed to the other veterans he had spoken to the ones who had shared their pain with him after hearing his story. He thought of the ones who were still struggling, still suffering in silence, and the idea that he had somehow sparked a movement, however small, filled him with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. "It's not about being strong on your own," John said, his voice firm. "It's about finding the strength to lean on others, to be vulnerable. That's where the real strength lies." Jason nodded, his expression shifting to one of determination. "I'm going to keep going. I'm not going to hide anymore." He took a deep breath, as if he had made a decision, a promise to himself. "I'm going to share my story too, just like you did." John felt a sense of peace settle over him. "That's the way," he said quietly. "That's the only way." Jason smiled, then turned to leave. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," he said before walking away. John watched him go, his thoughts swirling. The world had changed, and he had played a part in that change. He had shared his story, but it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the veterans who had been silent, who had carried their burdens alone for too long. And now, they were speaking out, telling their truths, and maybe, just maybe, healing in the process. As John sat back down at his table, a sense of contentment washed over him. The road had been long, and there had been days when he wondered if it was worth it. But now, seeing Jason and others like him take their first steps toward healing, he knew that it had been. He had made a difference, and that was enough. As the weeks passed, John Miller's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The interviews continued, and the stories from fellow veterans kept coming. Each one more powerful than the last. Each one another piece of the puzzle that showed the world what it truly meant to serve. John found himself surrounded by people who understood, people who had walked the same difficult road, and who now, thanks to his openness, were beginning to speak out as well. It was both humbling and overwhelming. One morning, As John sat in his living room, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a reporter. It wasn't a veteran. It was his daughter, calling from across the country. "Dad, I've been thinking," she said, her voice tentative. "I think you need to take a trip." John raised an eyebrow. "A trip? Where?" "Back to Washington," she replied. "To see the memorial. You've been talking about it for so long, about how it's never really felt like closure. Maybe it's time." He leaned back in his chair, letting the silence hang between them for a moment. His mind drifted to the memorial, the one in Washington, D.C., where the names of thousands of men who had served in Vietnam were etched into black granite. He'd never been able to bring himself to go. He didn't need to see the names to remember them. But she was right. Maybe it was time. "I don't know," John said slowly. "I've always avoided it. It's just too much. Too many memories." "I get it," she said, her voice filled with understanding. "But maybe it's time to face it, Dad. You don't have to go alone. You can take the trip at your own pace. But I think it would help." He paused for a long moment. His thoughts were a whirl of emotion. The thought of returning to the memorial stirred something deep inside him. He had avoided it for so long, kept himself from confronting the full weight of what he had lost, what they had all lost. But maybe, just maybe, facing it would be the final step in the healing process. "All right," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll do it. I'll go." The decision felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't going to be easy, but he knew it was something he had to do, for himself, and for the men he had served with. Over the next few days, John made arrangements for the trip. His daughter was flying in to join him, and they would make the journey together. As the day drew closer, John's nerves began to rise. He hadn't been to Washington in years, and the thought of facing the past head-on, of standing before the memorial, filled him with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. The flight was long, and the journey there felt like a blur. When they finally arrived at the hotel, John found himself looking out the window, staring at the skyline, but his mind was miles away. It was the next morning when they went to the memorial. They walked together down the long path, surrounded by other visitors, some of them veterans, others simply paying their respects. As they approached the wall, John felt a tightness in his chest. He stopped for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. The black granite was just as he remembered, polished and unyielding, reflecting the names etched into it. Names of men who had given everything for their country, their sacrifice immortalized in stone. His daughter stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm. "Dad, you don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "I'm here with you." John nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He knew she was there for him. But this moment, was something he had to face on his own. Slowly he stepped forward, his eyes scanning the names. The wall stretched out before him, an endless expanse of loss. Each name a memory, each name a life that had been taken too soon. John's fingers brushed against the cold surface of the stone, feeling the names beneath his touch. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the faces of the men he had fought with, the ones who had been taken from him. Wallace, the others, the men who had saved his life, who had died beside him. He whispered their names under his breath, as if speaking them aloud would bring them back, if only for a moment. His heart was heavy, the weight of the memories settling deep in his chest. But as he stood there, hand resting against the memorial, something shifted inside him. He wasn't just honoring the fallen. He was finally allowing himself to grieve. He had carried their memory for so long, buried it beneath the surface, too afraid to let it out. But now, as he stood before their names, he realized that grief wasn't a burden. It was part of the healing. It was part of remembering. "It's time," John whispered, the words barely audible. His daughter stood beside him, her eyes filled with understanding. "Yes, Dad, it's time." And in that moment, surrounded by the names of the fallen, John Miller finally found the closure he had been searching for all these years. He wasn't just honoring the memory of those he had lost. He was honoring his own journey, his own healing. And for the first time in decades, he felt the weight of his past lift, just a little. As he walked away from the memorial, hand in hand with his daughter, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that the men he had fought beside would never be forgotten, not as long as he was alive to tell their story. As John Miller sat on the porch of his small house, the evening air cool and calm, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The past few months had been a whirlwind, one he had never anticipated. His story, his life, had been shared with the world, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a forgotten soldier living in the shadows. He felt seen, heard, and, most importantly, understood. His phone buzzed, and he glanced down to see a message from his daughter. "I'm proud of you, Dad. Always have been. I love you." A small smile tugged at his lips as he typed a quick response. "I love you too." He set the phone down and looked out over the quiet yard. The sun had set, casting long shadows, but it felt like the calm after a storm, a stillness that carried with it the promise of healing. Over the past few months, John had spoken to countless people, veterans, civilians, even young soldiers who hadn't experienced the horrors of war. And with each conversation, he had seen the ripple effect his story had created. Veterans who had kept their memories locked away for years were now speaking out, telling their stories, sharing their struggles. It wasn't easy, but it was happening. John thought back to the day he had gone to the memorial in Washington. The pain of seeing the names of his fallen comrades etched into the stone had been overwhelming. But in that moment, he had realized something. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. The men he had fought with were still with him, their memories carried in his heart. And as long as he lived, he would carry their stories with him, telling them whenever he could. It was the least he could do. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a storyteller, a witness to history, a voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. He had found a new purpose, one that had been buried beneath the weight of silence for so many years. And now, it felt like that purpose was unfolding before him, like the beginning of a new chapter. His mind wandered back to Wallace, the man who had been his rock through it all. He had made a promise to Wallace, a promise to always honor their friendship and the sacrifices they had made together. Wallace had always said that they were brothers, bound by something stronger than the battlefield. And John had lived his life with that bond in his heart. It had never been about the medals or the recognition. It had always been about the men, the brotherhood, and the bonds they had formed in the heat of battle. Wallace was gone, but his memory, like the memories of all the men who had fought and fallen, would live on. John leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting as the stars began to twinkle above him. For the first time in a long time, he felt content. His journey was far from over, but he had come to terms with the past. He had faced it, shared it, and let it go. Now, he could finally look ahead. He didn't need the recognition. He didn't need the world to thank him. But knowing that his story had made a difference, that it had helped others who had been carrying the same burden, was enough. He had given a voice to the forgotten. And that was all that mattered. As the night grew darker, John stood up and walked inside, his mind at ease. He had lived through the worst and come out the other side. The pain, the loss, and the silence had all been part of his journey. But now, he was ready for whatever came next. And whatever it was, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking that road alone anymore. This emotional story takes you through the journey of John Miller, a man who carries the weight of his past and the memories of his fallen comrades. The emotional story unfolds as John finally opens up about his experiences in Vietnam, sharing the pain, loss, and healing that has shaped his life. As John faces the painful memories and the memories of those who didn't make it back, he finds healing in telling his story, giving voice to the silent struggles of veterans. This emotional story highlights the deep bonds of brotherhood formed in the heat of battle, and how the weight of those memories can affect one's life long after the war is over. The story brings awareness to the importance of honoring veterans, their struggles, and their sacrifices. It's a powerful emotional story about redemption, healing, and finally being seen and heard after years of silence. Through John's journey, we understand the importance of remembering those who gave everything for their country and the emotional toll that comes with it. In the end, this emotional story proves that sharing our struggles and honoring the past is not just a way to heal, but to inspire others to find their voice.